to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Brittnee Rock. She is the Director of Talent and Diversity at AB Wellco, aka Little Beet Brands and Quotidien. Brittnee, if you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Sure. Well, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Christina, for having me. My name is Brittnee Rock. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And what did I want to be when I wanted to grow up? I wanted to be a newscaster. I definitely saw myself on TV. I thought it was so cool to actually be out in the weather, reporting what the weather was going to be. But funny enough that we're having this conversation, but when I was younger, I didn't really see a lot of newscasters that looked like me.
Right.
And so it just was such a huge emphasis, and still is an emphasis, that representation matters. And so now there are so many women of color, Black and brown women, on air, with their natural hair, with different body shapes. And it is just so good to know that there is representation there and that they can provide a point of reference and inspiration for anyone who is thinking about being on air.
Absolutely. Representation is so important, especially in
Yes.
media as well, when you're growing up too. And you fast forward to today, I want to ask how your personal journey has really led you up until this point to be the Director of Talent and Diversity. I know we've done a webinar together, but always like to start off the conversation by asking there.
Sure. That is a loaded question. Wow. So, my journey, I grew up in the South Bronx, and my stomping grounds have definitely made me who I am. I've had a lot of moments in my life where I felt very othered. I went to a private boarding school in Connecticut where I was the one of only Black women or girls in my grade. And so I've had these experiences where I've been living in duality a little bit, where, I am who I am, but felt the need to present how, I thought the world wanted me to be at one point. And, when I got into my early 20s, I said, F that, I'm going to be who I am. And the more, as I've grown older, the more that I show up as Brittnee, it provides just more impact and influence in the spaces that I occupy. And so now, with being the Director of Talent and Diversity, I fully believe that my purpose here, not only in this job, but just in life in general, is to be an advocate for people and help people not find their voice, because I do believe that people always have their own thing, their own voice, but to help them project it. And so that is what I do a lot of in sort of occupying the space of talent and diversity.
I love that. I think that is so important, and also recognizing how kind of your personal journey and your stomping grounds has really impacted your perspective today, and really thinking about how you lead teams too. I know from the webinar and kind of our previous conversations as well, operationalizing equity is something that is really important. Instead of just talking about it as a philosophical idea or something that we just want to happen, you need to implement tangible strategies to make sure you are creating an equitable workplace, whether it's virtual, in person, or a hybrid of both. And one of the ways you talked about that was kind of asking those 3 questions, especially as a hiring manager. So I want to go through each of the 3 to talk about how a hiring manager would potentially kind of answer one of those. I believe the first is, number 1, whose experience is being centered.
Sure. Well, first, I want to start out by saying, again, talking a little bit about my journey, but I wanted to start off by saying that, in many instances in my life as a Black woman, I have been tested and assessed to see how well, I fit into white spaces or whiteness, right? So from childhood and taking certain, standardized tests, to applying to college, to applying for jobs, right? Traditionally, this assessment of fitting into, a culture or organization that is predominantly white has limited many people who are on the margin, specifically Black and Brown people, from experiences, exposure, and opportunities. And, most recently, I think, we are in a space of, reimagining and reinventing, traditional hiring practices, which have been traditionally discriminatory. And, as organizations create, develop, and scale the commitment to inclusion, equity, diversity, and justice, which in itself is so tiered, from a talent perspective, we have to acknowledge and address the systemic and process inequities that are consistently keeping people from opportunities. And so as I look to create more equitable opportunities, I lead with 3 questions for hiring managers to keep in mind throughout the recruitment and hiring process. And the first, which you so beautifully stated, was, whose experience is centered. And this question is important because it allows hiring managers to constantly check themselves about how they're interacting and showing up with candidates who do not look like them.
Right.
So how are you as a hiring manager creating a candidate experience that is centered on the individual you are speaking with? Mm-hmm. So how are you inquiring about their background, experience, their lens of life? How are you creating questions, feedbacks, and comments that allow for the candidate to show up authentically and really provide an avenue for you to understand who they are in this experience? And so, a lot of hiring managers are always interested in, can this candidate, get through the bump in the road? How hard are they willing to work? What's this person's work ethic? Which are, generic questions. But I think if you want to, dig deeper and find connection, because that's what the talent process is about, you can ask the candidate, if you feel comfortable, can you talk to me about a time in your life where you experienced a challenge or hardship and how you overcame it? And then depending upon their answer, then follow up and say, have you applied any of those tactics or frameworks to your work? And even if they haven't, it's okay, because to me, this question can truly unlock the depth of a person's willingness to succeed and overcome. And it can get the hiring manager, who might not have a clue about who this person is, more insight than what's on surface level.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the second question that I like to ask, in the hiring process is, is this next hire going to disrupt and dismantle the status quo? Mm-hmm. So, when we think about, qualifications for a role, sometimes I'm hearing, this person needs to have 12, 15 years of experience. And knowing that marginalized communities have been excluded from certain jobs or roles, not because they're not qualified, but because of lack of opportunities, how can we talk differently about assessing qualifications and experience that don't just revolve around numbers? And so, very often you'll hear people say, well, I don't have time to train someone, or, I need someone to hit the ground running. Like, these phrases lack empathy, and they aren't conducive to diversifying a talent pipeline, period, right? And, better yet, how are we as a company going to invest and spend company time and money to develop this person for any gaps that we may see from a skill standpoint? And so, I really sort of challenge hiring managers to, really give critical feedback to a hiring manager if they are saying this, because if they are, then that means that they aren't invested in creating, equal, equitable opportunities for certain candidates. And the third question that I like to sort of ask is, are you open to feedback, and how would you like it? And I think with any role, you need to hold people accountable. And sometimes there can be an intimidation or fear factor when having to give hard, valuable feedback, especially around anything that may pertain to race, gender, whatever it may be. And so by having this question be a part of, an initial intake form, you're setting and managing expectations that you will be giving feedback, and sometimes hard feedback, to ensure alignment on like what is right, because we know doing the right thing is not always the easiest thing. So ensuring that you are holding people accountable through giving them feedback is a great expectation to set from the beginning.
Absolutely. And I love those three kind of questions that you shared as well, because it really gives people a common framework and common language and a point of reference when they are talking to candidates. And it's really important to be intentional, have that empathy, and again, hold yourself accountable as well to make sure you're asking these questions and you're digging deeper below the surface, as you were talking about as well. And in addition to hiring managers really being accountable, candidates are keeping anyone part of the interview process accountable by asking really questions around the workplace, questions about who they're working with too. And I know one of the questions you and your team get a lot is around how are you supporting historically marginalized groups? How do you continue to answer that question, knowing that, equity is not something that is a check the box, we are an equitable place, so this is what we're doing about it. It's definitely a journey, but definitely wanted to ask your opinion on that.
Sure. And this is such an important question. And it is a question that so many, different identity groups, people who assume different identities, are asking out of the gate. And I always say rightfully so. Keep asking this question, y'all, because it is important. And the number one thing here that should be top of mind is, as a hiring manager, when this question comes up, don't oversell what you can't commit to.
Mm-hmm.
And far too often, people, on the margins, specifically Black and Brown people, are met with false promises. And so it is important that you remain honest about where you and your company are currently. And it's even more important to discuss, what action items and timeline your company is committed to in terms of supporting marginalized groups. So people don't just want to hear, oh, we plan to do this, or, we have hopes of doing this. Cool, great. But can you provide me a timeline and accountability measures of how you plan to get, support for certain groups? And so I just, I think it's important to, one, be honest, right? Don't oversell what you can't commit. And two, when you are, providing information or saying, hey, we plan to do this, provide a timeline for the candidate and what accountability your company is holding itself accountable to ensure that these commitments on supporting marginalized groups actually come to fruition. So it's about the action item, but then also the timeline to accompany that.
People can tell when you are being genuine, when you're being authentic, and when you're just providing them lip service or a blur.
100%.
Else, they're messing up on their work, and it could be really hard to say, okay, they're a great candidate, I want to say what they probably want to hear, but if you cannot back them up, they are not going to stay at the organization. They're going to know that you weren't being genuine in your response. So you definitely want to be intentional in kind of how you're sharing that timeline as well.
100%. And so you bring up a great point about being authentic and being honest. Like, you're right, candidates can sniff out when it's full of BS, right? And so to my point earlier, people have been met with false promises all the time. And, it's no secret that, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, justice is new to, the corporate world or other organizations. It is a new concept. So, we don't plan or expect for people to nail it or have it down right. We just ask that you be honest about where you are. And if you are actually implementing something, I need the data and I need the facts, right? I need a timeline and I need to know who's accountable. So if I choose to come into your organization, I know what the timeline is and I know who I'm holding accountable for what.
Mm-hmm. Again, being specific about the details, contextualizing what the commitments you're saying perhaps, or the strategies that you're sharing with this candidate are so important. I think it's interesting for kind of the brands that we talked about as well, and just the organization overall. You have folks who are in the corporate organization, and you have folks that are really important that are in the field, they're in stores. What are the ways that you're building a really cohesive company culture to feel like everybody is kind of on the same page or feel like they are equally valued at the organization?
Sure. I think, when you are in an infrastructure where there is a natural sort of hierarchy of, I'm here, you're here by nature, you have to do everything in your power to dismantle it.
Mm-hmm.
So some would say, Brittnee, I'm a chief of this, or I'm a director of this. And, your position in the organization means that you lead or guide a function in the company. And you can do that without upholding the negative hierarchy concepts and emotions, right? And so I feel like you can do that a couple of ways. First, stop calling your team or space the corporate team or corporate office, right? That was one change that we actually made in our company. So we now refer to ourselves as a support team because our job is to literally support our in-store field teams, period. And so the language, a company chooses to use is always impactful. And every chance you should be making an impact to support and inspire, not to draw the gap wider.
Mm-hmm.
Second is, get your butt in the store. Like whether that is a restaurant company you work for, a hospitality brand, retail, make sure you spend time in the store. I don't care what your position is at the support office, make sure you are visible and be intentional about how you show up there. So it's an opportunity, to get to know the field team members at a particular location. Work hip to hip with them in the store. Be a barista for a couple of hours, chop up some onions, clean the floor, fix the clothes on the clothing racks, right? Like whatever it may be, let people know that you support them and you're not just there to observe.
Mm-hmm.
Also, take it as an opportunity to hear the pain points, hear the successes, the goals of people that are working in the field. You will be surprised how, your presence can really do wonders in a field team, and it can re-energize, it can motivate. If you are a part of a support team and, you are a person of color or a person who is a part of a marginalized group, it's even more important that you go into the field team stores because 90% of field employees are people on the margin, right? So whether you're a director, manager, or part of C-suite, it's so important that, people in our field, in the field teams, see people who look like them in these roles, right? You can't be what you can't see. So, me as a woman of color, as a director, when I go into the stores and people see me, if I have braids or if I choose to have nails on, acrylic nails at that, like, wow, you work. Yes, I do. And so you can do it too. And so that visibility, again, that representation is so important. So that's two. The third thing is, I would really say, fight for the people in the field, always. Make sure that their voice is always a part of the decision-making process, right? 9 times out of 10, the decisions the support teams make affect the field teams. Mm-hmm. So when the conversation comes up about policy, about benefits, whatever it may be, make sure that you advocate for them, but also invite their voices into the conversation.
Absolutely. And the way that you understand the voice is also to what you're saying too, like get in the field, really be alongside folks as well. And that representation too, as you were talking about for the earlier kind of question of when you were younger, what did you want to be when you grew up? That's so important across all levels too. And having that visibility, representation is so important. We've talked about looking at intentionally built exclusive systems and shaking it up and really redesigning them to be more equitable, intentionality with leadership, and kind of understanding that common language too. Are there any kind of mistakes that you're seeing other companies make, so not necessarily internally in their equity strategy as well, that are perhaps cautionary tales? Again, recognizing that everybody's on a different part of their equity strategy, and even with the best of intentions.
That is a great, great question. Um, so a couple of things. Employee resource groups, ERGs, at this point for me, is low hanging fruit, and ERGs are not the solve for your equity issues. And I know that's gonna ruffle some feathers. I know. I'm sorry out there, y'all, but like it truly is not the solve for the equity issue. So majority of companies at this point, in my opinion, should have ERGs, right? Not only put in place, but they should be financially supported, and the person who is leading these ERGs should have resources, right? And if you don't have that, don't do the ERG. Second, if your company has, a DE&I leader and it's only one person with no budget or support team, throw the DE&I commitment away. Like you're not ready for it, okay? And so I think those are the things that companies sort of go to for their equity strategy to create some sort of, it's because, it truly puts the onus on the identity group, whatever group that is, right? And that isn't a part of the equity strategy. You're asking people who are already assuming this burden through their lived experience to do more of the work.
Right.
So what I will say, I think there's an important question that needs to get asked, when people are creating their equity strategy. And the question is, what are you willing to give up and sacrifice? Mm-hmm. Are you willing, to give up the privilege of making more money than the women and people of color in your company? Are you willing to be held accountable on your ego and white male privilege? Are you willing, to be held accountable every time you speak over a woman or person of color? Are you willing to remain uncomfortable, right? Are you willing to challenge everything you thought about race, gender, class, all of it, right? That's truly the question, right? And this work is not easy, but for every sacrifice, there is something on the other side. And so, ERGs, employee resource groups, they are a piece of the puzzle, yes, but equity strategy is about dismantling systems and rebuilding them, period, right? Rebuilding the system of talent, rebuilding compensation with an equitable lens, right? Rebuilding C-suite in terms of with coaching, with accountability, right? It is truly about dismantling the system. So if your equity strategy is not talking about how you're literally going to break down a function or part of your company to rebuild it with an equitable lens to ensure that the right people are at the table to ensure success on that, you're doing it wrong.
Absolutely. I definitely agree, especially the piece around resourcing employee resource groups, investing in folks, compensating them for their time, and also the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, even a program manager, someone who's in
right.
the role as well. It's really important to look at the entire system and not look at a Band-Aid approach or look at things that are saying, oh, we're doing this, but in reality, all of the systems for talent, retention, performance reviews, they're all the same. It's not going to work unless everybody is on board with this strategy too. And I do want to kind of ask around specifically for leaders too. A lot of people who are in executive roles or manager roles, they're really kind of relearning and they have more responsibility now to really ask how folks are doing, lead with empathy, lead with equity. Is there anything that you say like the generation of leaders to come need to have in order to be really successful in their roles as people managers or managers of managers, what have you?
That's a really great question. I asked this where I finished the webinar last time with this question is about, activism and allyship. And, allyship is on a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And so, to truly be an ally, like you really have to really do the work. And when I mean by doing the work, I mean it is the introspective work, right? It doesn't stop, when 5 p.m., reaches and you leave the office. No, the introspective work keeps happening. You have to consistently challenge yourself, not only in the workspace, but outside of the workspace. And so really thinking about, what your allyship and activism looks like, right? It's about challenging yourself constantly about how you think, about how you, enter certain situations. And so, this work truly is introspective work. And, the surface level stuff isn't going to get the change that you think you're going to exhibit, in your organization. Like, you really have to take time to challenge yourself and your thoughts and everything that you thought, to really sort of be authentic and genuine and what your allyship looks like, right? And I always say this, like, allyship, looks different for everybody, and everybody's not going to be the same. People are going to enter the conversation at different points, right? And so really consistently challenging yourself and how you think, and really breaking down, what does it mean to be anti-racist, right? Like that is a lot, right? And figuring out, how do you own, what piece of the puzzle do you own, right? What piece of the puzzle have you contributed to when it comes to being, racist, right? Like, so really sort of figuring that stuff out. It's not going to stop and end with your equity strategy, right? Like, it truly is an ever going learning process for people in terms of their allyship and how they show up. So the work is continuous. So I would just challenge people to continuously think about, after the clock strikes 5, right? Continuously thinking about what this work is, right? Because who you are doesn't dissipate when you walk into the four walls of your organization, right? That's always going to show up. So if I'm presenting in my organization like, oh, I care about this, but I go home and, I'm having, not friendly or racist conversation, like that, all that's going to come into your work, whether you are part of an equity strategy or not, right? So it's all in alignment. You can't fake the funk with stuff like this, right? So you have to continuously figure out, how am I showing up? How am I constantly challenging myself? What questions am I asking myself? How can I hold myself accountable, in these situations? So that would sort of be my advice is, ensure that you are continuing to do the introspective work, on the things that you are committing to in your organization and in your life.
Absolutely. In your life, it's definitely important to make sure that you're committed to this, and also that self-awareness piece that could be a little bit scary, the internal work with a capital W, but you have to do it, especially if you are in an environment where you are a manager and you're managing people who look differently than you, who identify and have different personalities and lived and learned experiences, and also understanding that everybody is going through something different in their life as an employee, but also as a person is really important. So I think I definitely agree with you there as well. And then is there anything, Brittnee, that I either didn't ask that you want to share, or 1 to 2 key takeaways in terms of that self-awareness piece, understanding your own allyship, being really intentional and focusing on action, that you want to share with our listeners, so they can bring it with them after listening to our conversation here today?
Sure. Specifically, like, on, the spaces that we occupy, um, we are powerful beings. And, if you are, occupying a space, specifically, I guess, in this context professionally, where
Right.
you own, a function of a company, I really challenge you to think about how you're showing up and wanting to dismantle, the current system or process, right? Whether that's talent, whether it's marketing, whatever it may be. I
Yeah.
truly challenge you to, figure out how to make that space that you occupy more equitable, more fair, more inclusive, and truly continue to challenge leadership, y'all. Please do. And I know it's not easy. Sometimes we feel like we're alone, in this fight for justice. But truly gather people who you feel like are on your side, or who can help you really push these movements forward within your organization, because it truly is a journey. Excuse me, this isn't going to happen overnight, but the more that you are persistent, the more that you have accountability measures for people within your organization, the more we can see the needle being pushed here.
Absolutely. You have the power also just to make a difference in one person or hundreds, thousands of people's lives. And also doing the internal work is so important in order for this kind of change to manifest as well. So I think this is a really good call to action to kind of cap off our conversation. Brittnee, thank you so much for your passion for this work and also for taking the time to have this conversation on reimagining company culture this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Christina.
And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the company to succeed overall. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.